Um, Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Renaud Girard. I am the Foreign Affairs columnist of Le Figaro. Le Figaro is a French daily newspaper. And I have the honor to moderate this panel devoted to mapping Central Asia connectivity. So everybody have probably the map of Central Asia in their heads. We don't have a map here, but you have on the west the Caspian Sea, on the north Russia, on the east China, and on the north, so below Russia, you have a huge country, Kazakhstan, where we are now, and then you have Uzbekistan, but Uzbekistan does not touch Caspian Sea, and then you have Kyrgyzstan, and then more south, you have Turkmenistan, and you have Tajikistan. The border in the south is made by Iran and Afghanistan touches China. So this is the geography. And we are going to speak about connectivity, how to improve connectivity for the regional stability, for the development, for the trade integration. We're going to speak about that, how we can improve this connectivity between, in this region, between the Caspian Sea and China, between Russia and Iran and Afghanistan. So to answer this theme, this field, we have the chance of having as speakers Yerkin Tukumov. Can I ask, okay, everybody, can I ask you to stand? Mr. Tukumov is the director of the Kazakh Institute for Strategic Studies. So he's a kind of host for us, thank you. Thank you for Kazakhstan to host us. And then on his right, you have Faruk Sultanov, who is a country officer of IFC, International Finance Corporation. It belongs to the World Bank Group. It's an institution to help private sector, only private sector. Then we have Aziza Umarova. She's from Uzbekistan, and she is the head of Delivery Unit Agency for Strategic Reforms in Uzbekistan. Then we have William Thompson, head of Eurasia Division in OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, that sits in Paris, that was founded in the beginning of the 60s. And then, last but not least, we have Dmitry Maryashin, who comes from Geneva. Is the Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, so working for the United Nations, of course, he stands in Geneva. So thank you very much. My first question will be, so it's a debate. It's very open debate. There will be only questions, no speeches. So my first question will be to William. William, from OECD, you see the whole picture. How do you see the current connectivity between these 5 states, and what kind of obstacles you see and what kind of progresses, according to you, they can be?
Thank you very much for the question, and thank you to our host, Kazakhstan, for having us here for this opportunity. The OECD, together with our sister organization, the International Transport Forum, has worked for a number of years on connectivity issues in Central Asia. And in fact, at the then AEF, the Astana Economic Forum in 2019, we actually presented our first major report on these issues. We are now working on 2 projects in parallel. I won't describe them in detail. One funded by Kazakhstan on really further developing the work we presented in 2019. But the shift in emphasis has been from transport policy and transport infrastructure, corridors, infrastructure bottlenecks, to the softer side. Trade facilitation is very much at the center of those activities. And we are also working on a project on the middle corridor, really focused on what the private sector thinks about this and needs and wants and what its expectations are, surveying private sector players. And I just want briefly to highlight the themes that come from both of those 2 projects. The first is that we better be here to talk about integration, not just connectivity, not just transit or transport, but economic integration. We do not want to make Central Asia simply a vast piece of real estate through which other people are running very fast trains, and where there may be some benefit from constructing those rail lines at a certain point, but it will be limited, without developing the potential of the region to become more integrated. And what does that mean? First of all, what we see is that it means looking at the soft side, where we have focused a lot of our attention, at trade facilitation, at alignment of standards, at governance issues, which I know others will be speaking about, to make trade as seamless as possible across the region. You can build all the physical infrastructure you want, but if the other issues are not resolved efficiently, it's not going to happen. The soft infrastructure is just as important. Secondly, the private sector has a clear emphasis on what they really want to see as these corridors and this transit develops will be mechanisms for assuring transparent price formation and stability and predictability of pricing. And I think pricing is one of the things that doesn't get enough discussion when people are often talking about the middle corridor. I'm watching the clock very closely, so I'll just make a couple of other observations. The first is that beyond...
William, just can you show us, can you tell us where is the middle corridor? Where does it go
The middle
through?
corridor is more formally known as the Trans-Caspian International Trade Route. So the most direct route would be Kazakhstan, then across the Caspian to Azerbaijan, through Georgia, then on perhaps to Turkey or the Black Sea. But one of the critical things about the middle corridor is that the countries that are neighboring it also have a role to play. They also have potential to be realized. It won't make sense to develop it on its own. And in fact, one of the things that is emerging in our study of the middle corridor and in other work as well, not only we are coming to this conclusion, is that it makes much more sense to the extent that it generates trade and doesn't simply divert trade flows, which means it is again about economic integration, it is about market integration in the region among the countries of the region, as well as transit through the region. If it is developed primarily with transit in mind, it will simply never realize its potential. There are too many frontiers, there are too many changes of mode, there is too much distance. It has real potential, but that potential lies not simply in taking trade that might have used the northern route. It lies in developing the broader integration potential of Central Asia. And for that to happen, in addition to having proper price mechanisms and structures, I think we need a couple of things. First, yes, there's a lot of investment in physical infrastructure to be done. It's not the only thing, but I don't want to neglect it. Particularly developing capacity on the western shore of the Caspian and the eastern shore of the Black Sea. Those are where we see potential bottlenecks. And it requires a level of coordination that will have to go beyond occasional intergovernmental agreements. As with the Eurasian Rail Union that has kind of operated the northern route, there needs to be a coordinating body made up of the participating states with shareholdings perhaps, I think, organized with some real economic incentives to ensure that it has reason to run efficiently and operate on a very commercially sound basis. There needs to be, I think, a governance structure there that is capable of coordinating. And I've already overrun my time, so I'll stop there and hope I get another chance later.
Just one question, William. Do you have any idea what is the percentage of the goods coming from China to Europe transiting through this corridor? What is the percentage of the Belt and Road Initiative?
The estimates vary, and I'd need to reach for my laptop to give you numbers. But
but just basically.
Even after the explosive growth in percentage terms that we saw in 2022, it is a fraction of what was traversing the northern route. And what's more, the perception that like the northern route stopped is incorrect. I mean, if you talk to people like Deutsche Bahn Eurasia, you will find they are still moving a lot of traffic along that northern route, and a lot of the Europe-China trade is still going that way. But the best estimates I've seen suggest that even fully developed as a transit route, it's only a fraction of what the northern corridor was. The distances are longer. You've got multiple modal shifts from rail to sea, back to rail, and so on. You've got more frontiers. There's a lot you can do to make that smoother. But I really want to emphasize that we see this as a project that has tremendous potential for generating trade in the region. And that requires policies that go beyond constructing a transit corridor.
Thank you very much, William. And we understand that this disruption or possible disruption of supply chains, but also demographic shifts motivate Central Asian states to map a broader connectivity mechanism. So I would like, Yerking, to ask you a question. How do you think demographic shifts influence not only Kazakhstan, but only the whole region?
Thank you very much for this wonderful question. But please, let me first refer to the previous speaker. He said about economic integration in Central Asia. And one of the biggest takeaway we can get from this session is just do not make any misperception and misjudgment about process of integration. We've done a lot of this misperception before in recent decades, and now we don't have this chance of misperception and misleading. There should not be any pinky promises between our leaders in Central Asia and make some, this without any foundation to make real integration. So we have to draw a real picture how to step by step we make a kind of starting with baby steps. And one of the baby steps, we can just understand how demography changing our region. And please allow me to apply to the concept already introduced by Moses Naim. He's a former chief of staff of Foreign Policy Journal. He introduced very wonderful perception of three revolutions that already taking place in the world. It's a revolution of the multitude, revolution of mobility, and revolution of mentality. That's an all-above revolution already taking place in all Central Asian states. So it's a revolution of multitude. It's already happening. 30 years ago, it was only 50 million people living in Central Asia. Now it's around 80 million people. And by 2050, it's going to be 100 million people. So it's we are going to be bigger and bigger in terms of population in the region. In terms of and yes, life expectancy is also increasing, averaging 70 years in the region. Poverty is declining. In Tajikistan, it fell from 37% to almost 30%. In Kazakhstan, it fell from 65% in 2001 to almost above 10% in 5 years ago. So it's a good numbers. I mean, we have to think about it. The region is changing, and in terms of mobility, more and more people are traveling within the countries and abroad. The rate of urbanization is growing. In Kazakhstan, it's already reached 61%. And there is a potential to grow more and more. The rate of urbanization is going to be bigger and bigger. It means that more and more people have better access to education, healthcare, internet, new technologies, and everything. In terms of mentality, is the most important thing. The average age of Central Asian populations is under 30. It means that they were born after the collapse of Soviet Union. There is no any nostalgia for these old gold times. And finally, what we have in the nutshell, we have younger population under 30 years, more open to new technologies, more urban, more educated in terms of technology. They have more critical approach to the power institutions, and they bring a lot of challenges to the current model of public administration, and we have to think about it, how we can redesign and fulfill the new model, new approach to public administration in Central Asia, and that in turn to increase this connectivity within the region in terms of human capital, in terms of migration, in terms of trade and everything. So it's a lot of questions we have to think about.
And just a supplementary question, Yelkin. In 40 years of the ethnic composition of Central Asia has changed quite a lot. What is the effect of this change on the connectivity of these 5 states?
First of all, in terms of revolution of mentality. So it's more attitude and more sense of national identity. They tend to be more religious, with a more religious attitude. They tend to be more open to the previous norms, better for the worse or to the better, but they are who they are. So and this change the way of thinking in terms of public administration, creating new narrative of history, of foreign policy and internal policy. So it's altogether, that's the bigger takeaways that we can get from the collapse of Soviet Union in terms of demography.
And this, you said that now the nations, they think themselves are the nations, especially that you have a young population. It's not the Soviet time anymore. It's not USSR, the nation. It's a different sovereign nations. But do you feel that this revival of nation nationalism can be put peace in jeopardy, can be dangerous, or the current institutions of cooperation can handle the 5 countries? I ask this question, of course, because you have currently brothers like Russians and Ukrainians fighting each other.
No. No, I mean, there is no any danger in terms of tension between different nations within the region. It doesn't. I mean, and there is no any tension right now, and that wouldn't be in the future.
This is good. So it allows, of course, connectivity.
Can I
to
add,
progress.
please, if you allow me,
yes, please.
Mr. Moderator? I would like just to give you a story. I think it's a very positive story that will inspire many of us. 2 years ago, the Ministry of Trade and Integration of Kazakhstan was negotiating with Amazon the ability of the Kazakh sellers to be present on the platform. And it took them almost 6 months. But to our surprise, they negotiated in bulk all 5 countries of Central Asia. And actually now any part of Central Asia can be present officially as a sellers on Amazon. And Kazakhstan did it because they just realized the value that will be created. Even if somebody is exporting not from Kazakhstan, but let's say from Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, we 3 countries enjoy GSP and GSP plus preferential treatment with EU markets. But we definitely struggle sometimes with logistics. So this agreement comes in handy, and it shows, I think, a very good will that countries exercise, even at the level of the young generation of ministers in all 5 countries, at least 4 countries. And that shows, I think, rather optimistic outlook for future of the region than possible violence or conflict that were implied, I think, in your question. Thank you.
No, I would go on with you, Aziza, because it's quite interesting. It's good news for the day, so thank you. And so my question is, how do you think these 5 countries could connect more from now?
I think the question how is the most critical one. And we all know what should be done, but sometimes how, it's exactly where we have a lot of troubles and impediments. But I would like to give you another story that I had the privilege to be part of, and it actually shows how in a very short time span with some new regulations you can really open up the whole potential of the new industry. In Uzbekistan, until recently, we didn't have a state regulator for transportation. It was resting with the SOEs, state-owned enterprises. And in 2019, the Ministry of Transport was created, and there was a big, very important reform undertaken in the aviation when the monopolistic company that would be flying the airlines were divided from the management of the airports. And at that time, it was very difficult because we had a lot of, not very good assets. It really took a lot of restructuring, a lot of change management processes. But in the meantime, Uzbekistan opened up to the world, and we waived visa to nations from 92 countries. So right now, more than 90 countries are able to free come to Uzbekistan without any visa. And that definitely had implications on the number of travels that took place in Uzbekistan. And we have 11 international airports. So basically, last year, Uzbekistan flew 8 million passengers. This year, the forecast is 9.3 million passengers. We're already 30% above pre-COVID level. It's one of those very rare cases in this part of the world. And the year when we waived visa to Tajikistan, more than 1 million Tajiks crossed the border and visited Uzbekistan. It's a country that was, and Farouk is from Tajikistan, he was nodding. That just shows you the potential of integration in Central Asia, at least at the level of people to people, if you do regulations right. Even without the hardware per se, it's just about letting regulations loose to really enable the best of potential to happen. And a couple of weeks ago, we had a visit of the president of Singapore to Uzbekistan, and Uzbekistan Airports Company, and I happen to be a member of the board of that company as well. There is an agreement now with Changi to do feasibility study for the new airport, to consider whether it's worth building greenfield project and make it, part of the changing dynamics in this part of the region. I have to say that in Central Asia, we still have a place, uncharted terrain that could benefit tremendously from new regulations, from ease of doing business, but also of deregulation. Less government engagement means more private sector engagement, and that's something that at least in Uzbekistan that we are trying to do now with a big administrative reform, trying to make government nimble, agile, and leave up and free up space to the private sector to take more prominent role in all industries, starting with transportation, with aviation, with all new service economies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, Farouk, you work for IFC, so your role for the World Bank is to help private sector to develop. So, Can you tell us the progresses that have been done in the last, I would say, 30 years in this field of private businesses, and what are the obstacles for progression, and how connectivity between these 5 states of Central Asia could help the private sector to boom even better?
Thank you very much. Indeed, development of private sector is part of our DNA. And since I'm responsible for Tajikistan, I will be mainly talking about Tajikistan. But there are some developments that also affect or applicable to the other Central Asian countries. But to begin with, I would like to mention that portrait of business is more or less the same in all 5 countries for specific reasons. Number one, there is not much of history of private sector. You know, it's like 30 years of independence. There is a whole new generation of companies appeared who still are in the learning process. And another interesting fact is that probably what we are, as a Central Asia, one of the few regions in the world where the transfer of assets has never happened for the last 4 or 5 generations. You know, starting from October Revolution, then Second World War, then breakup of Soviet Union, Civil War, all those aspects like wasn't very useful to transfer the asset from one generation to other generation of the businesses. So it creates a specific mindset. If you look to companies in Uzbekistan or in Tajikistan, you will see that it's usually a family-run business with a different small assets, never combined, never like consolidated as a one big asset. So that's one of the things. But if you look at the picture, a wider picture, you will see that FDI stock increased 17 times for the last 20 years in Central Asia. GDP growth was 7.5%, 750%. So it's pretty substantial figures. And the beauty of connectivity is that, and I would like to echo the example of Aziza, is that when you build a road, the beauty of the road is that it works both ways. So when million Tajiks go to Uzbekistan, around 1 million Uzbeks coming to Tajikistan as well. And that's very helpful. Here I also would like to stress the argument of my colleague who also mentioned that it's very good that there is a mutual understanding, and I think the President Tokayev mentioned about that as well, that there is a mutual understanding between the leadership as well. And the signal is very right now. Of course, there are some small issues, for instance, between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, border-related issues that definitely will find its solution soon, we hope at least. We also see that there is some tensions between Central Asia and Afghanistan from time to time, but that also should be, it's also a solvable issue. And I believe that private sector in Central Asia is probably one of the most resilient part of the society. We will be able to grow further as well, because the average growth rate for the last 20 years is around 6% for the whole region. So it's pretty substantial. Last but not least, talking about the issues, issues persist definitely. Market size, was one of the issues. Before Uzbekistan, like relaunching process of regionalization, let's put it this way, every businesses used to concentrate around their own population. Now we have like market of the 70 million, which is already sizable. Access to finance probably one of the major issues that we experience now, but again, it's probably our task as an IFIs to make sure that that problem is solved. With that, I would like to pass mic to you. Thanks.
I would just to add about how you asked how we can cooperate in better way, and the Prime Minister of Uzbekistan has already answered that. Just get back to work. This is a brilliant answer, and then there is a pure political and economic pragmatism behind our political elites. And what is more important, there is a trust between the leaders of Central Asia. Everything starts with this trust. And now I explain it already demographic shifts that may help in some way this better connectivity. And what we really miss is just, kind of united approach to the region, which is misperceived for many, many years, like Marshall Plans, something like that, for heavy investment in Central Asia with cooperation of our neighbors, Russia, China, United States, and everything. We don't want to take a side. We want that Central Asia should be a field for cooperation, not for the battle.
I think this is a very important theme because I come from Europe, and of course we remember that after having so many wars in Europe, we had three leaders actually. They were from the same kind of ideology. They were Christian Democrats in the 50s in France. You had, of course, Schuman in France, and you have Adenauer in Germany, and you had Gasperi in Italy. And these three leaders were very close together, and they had the same, and they built Europe, which is quite a success, we can say. And a lot of countries want still to be part of this Europe that was built in the 50s. So I think that I would like Yerkin and also all of you to react to do you see some kind of political common market starting or trying to start in this region in order to be united when you have like powerful neighbors like China, like Russia, or even a friend which is a little bit not far away, which is Turkey. So do we see some kind of this hope, at least in the youth of these countries, for such a adventure that we had in Europe in the 1950s?
Thank you. Once again, my name is Dimitri. I'm the deputy head of the UN Regional Commission for Europe. I guess this is why the question about the European project in Central Asia is coming to me. But Central Asia is part of the Economic Commission for Europe, and in that sense, I think we as an entity embody the sense that we really need to think globally, cross-regionally, and look beyond sub-regional groupings and corners of the world. And I'll start with this. You're giving me a perfect opportunity. I think we need to be discussing not just Central Asia connectivity, but Central Asia plus connectivity. Reality is that this is too small a market to be sustainable in its own right. And the reality is that it does have to look east-west and north-south at the same time. So when we talk corridors, we need to be realistic about that. Secondly, it does require common approaches to solving problems, and I'll try to illustrate a bit later that one of the sources of these common approaches is by referring to global standards and norms that already exist, be it the World Trade Organization on the trade side, be it the UN norms and standards on trade, connectivity, transport side, and I'll mention some of those. Thirdly, it's a region that needs to be aware of the global trends and not to be insular. As much as common identity rooted in common culture and ethnicity and language is important, and we see a very important role, for example, that the Organization of Turkic States as an emerging platform is playing. But first of all, not all people of Central Asia are Turkic, and secondly, this region needs to connect to other cultures and understand the trends. And the best example of this is the shifting from ethnic to carbon border adjustment mechanism of the European Union, which is coming and which will affect the realities of traders across Central Asia and globally in terms of how they can position their products.
Dmitry, can you explain to the audience exactly what is this mechanism so that we understand?
I think the colleagues from the European Union will be better placed to explain it, and if there is anybody who fully understands it, I'd like to meet that person. But it is basically a system which will put a price on carbon which is emitted either when producing or transporting goods. And that is a completely new approach to trading and to pricing, as Bill was saying. To be competitive, you need to be well priced. And for that, from 2025 onwards, you'll need to account for your carbon footprint. So awareness of these global trends and being able to position your goods and services in line with global trends is what we think is extremely important. So if you allow me, I'll start with energy, because I want to talk about energy, transport, and trade, maybe in the first round just energy. And here, somebody mentioned that this is no longer a region where most people remember as the Soviet past. Well, there was one thing in the Soviet past that actually worked quite well, and it was called a single Central Asian power system. For all intents and purposes, it was the only workable solution to get the forever water energy conundrum somehow solved in this region of upstream, downstream countries, countries that depend on each other on energy supply and access to water resources. And right now, it is not working. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the system has broken down for obvious reasons. Now, we believe that rethinking energy infrastructure and approaches to energy in Central Asia requires interconnection. So interconnecting back, not necessarily exactly how it was done during the Soviet times, but in a way that encompasses the electricity grid, the gas grid, and also makes it compatible for new types of energy, such as hydrogen, low carbon and green hydrogen. Why is this important? Well, because you need to have more reliability. All of you living in Central Asia, even in resource-rich countries, know about blackouts being a reality. All of you know that there are countries where rural areas still are year-long with intermittent energy supply, even though the same countries might have abundant renewable energy resources in the form of hydro. So the system doesn't provide the stability it needs, and we all know that the grid also enables much more renewable energy generation. So the real shift to green energy in Central Asia is only possible with an interconnected grid. The positioning of Central Asia in the hydrogen market is only possible if you have transportation for hydrogen which is economically viable. And that means today's gas pipelines need to be designed in a certain way for tomorrow. And the interesting fact about it, you would say, oh, Dmitry, but you know, what are you talking about? Well, I'm talking about $1.4 trillion needed between 2020 and 2050 to ensure strengthening energy resilience and no blackouts, basically, right? But guess what? Guess what? Same timeline, only 2% more investment would enable us to do no blackouts and a carbon-neutral energy system in Central Asia. This is based on the calculations which we have performed as part of our carbon neutrality toolkit at UNSCE, and now we're launching a very important cooperation with the German government, with GIZ, to actually then fill this with content to get the exact data and help policymakers in the region to get to a point where they can actually turn this into concrete actions and hopefully do it together across countries. So Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan working on shared capacities on water energy, difficult because interests are involved. There are property, ownership issues. There are tough issues to solve. But if there is one thing that the leaders need to show political goodwill for, it is the energy-water nexus and getting the system to be carbon neutral and not just resilient.
Thank you very much. Do you have William and Aziza first, and William, then I think you want to say something.
I just would like to make a very quick remark. I was just checking British Petroleum data. It says that Turkmenistan supposedly sits on the 19.5 trillion cubic meters of gas. So perhaps it's just about reconfiguring relationships within the region as much as talking about trying to fix what's going on right now, because we have quite self-sufficient region with a lot of resources that would be definitely enough for all of us to share if we do it wisely.
William, to build a kind of interconnected system, energy system like we had during USSR, what would we need in this region, according to you?
I'm not sure I could give you figures about what we need, but I endorse, even if it's not 2%, even if it's a bit more than 2%, the critical point to realize is when you see these staggering figures about what green infrastructure will require, you have to take off from them what we're going to have to invest even if we don't do any greening, and you start to realize, first of all, that the price we are paying actually to do it in a sustainable way is not so much more, and in fact, it avoids us investing in stranded assets that we will later on just regret having on the books. And of course, the faster the technology develops, the faster that cost margin comes down anyway. But I wanted to come back, in fact, on your comparison of the European project in Central Asia. I mean, we're a long way from there, but there are two observations that I think could be relevant. One, we've been hearing a lot about with energy, with Amazon, with transport, and that is that, of course, Europe took a very long time to build. And it began with very specific areas of important sectoral cooperation, coal and steel community being at the origin. Don't build any integration project on coal, please. But energy...
Even though it's a massive part of the energy balance of this region
energy,
still.
But energy very definitely is a part of that. But it was done step by step, and it began with sectoral cooperation, and it took decades, and that was fine. Probably, and that's one lesson, and we're already seeing some of those steps, as you mentioned, baby steps. They're not even baby steps, some are quite important. But the second is the geopolitical context. In the old days when I was a university professor, I sometimes had fun setting an exam question for my students, which was, Stalin was the father of the European Union. Discuss. Because of course the geopolitical confrontation created an enabling environment for European integration. I would not wish such a confrontation on Central Asia ever. Don't worry, that's not my suggestion at all. Nonetheless, it is the case that Central Asia sits between two very large neighbors, which represent certain opportunities, but also certain risks and problems that have to be managed. And it is my firm conviction, and here I go out of my OECD role, I'm speaking personally as somebody who's known this region since the 1980s. Real conflict, if there's real conflict in Central Asia, the winners will not be from Central Asia. And I believe that the people who are governing Central Asia understand that Central Asia's future, maintaining its independence, its identities, depends a lot on that capacity to cooperate, to work together. They're not enormous economies, but collectively they're much more significant. Their bargaining leverage is better together. And I think there is an awareness there that when they work together, they can do things that none of them could do individually. And if they start to quarrel, there are other players outside the region who stand to benefit more than anyone in the region at all. So I hope we see this step-by-step integration continue.
Thank you very much. Yerkin?
When I mentioned about baby steps, I mean that we are really love in Central Asia to make these unattainable goals and then fail. So I just want to say that let's start with some kind of real things. Like when we talk about connectivity in Central Asia, let's think about direct flights between capitals in Central Asia. In order to fly from, for example, from Astana to Ashgabat, we have to fly via Dubai, Istanbul, etc. So is it about connectivity? What we are talking about? And so let's start with this. I would say baby step. You can say initial steps. It doesn't matter. So let's start with some real attainable goals. I would love this concept Central Asia Plus. Why? And I would love to divide this concept into two layers. The first one, some pending issues like water issue, border conflicts, and everything could be solved within Central Asia, but Central Asian states themselves. So our destiny, our independence, our sovereignty should be designed and fulfilled in Ashgabat, in Astana, in Dushanbe, in Tashkent, and in Bishkek. That's it. It's anywhere else, it's prohibited. But there are some issues like climate change, COVID-19. There is no border between all these issues. So we have to cooperate with our neighborhoods, with great powers and everything. So it doesn't contradict to each other, but we have to be very realistic. What could be done in Central Asia within, and what could be done with cooperation with other states?
Good. So let's start by direct flights between these 5 capitals. It will take time because I know Africa very well, and I can tell you that even in Africa, even in the African states of former French colonies, you don't have direct flights. They have to fly through Paris and down. It's crazy. But I hope it will work much quicker in this region that Aziza, you have the floor.
Just a quick remark. I think it's really regrettable that to Ashgabat we still have to fly through Istanbul. However, to the rest of the region, we definitely have daily flights. Both to Dushanbe we have regular flights, but also to Almaty, to Astana, but now also from Almaty to Samarkand. There are several flights a week, and I was very happy to see that people are taking these routes now for long weekends, flying with children, with family, a bustling airport. I've just checked Samarkand airport the last time, maybe 3 weeks ago. I can assure you there is definitely visible improvement. However, I would agree that it's not the same for all capitals of Central Asia. And definitely we need to rope in more and more Turkmenistan on all these regional initiatives.
So let's go on with transport. Yes, Dmitry, we are listening to you.
Perfect segue into what?
10 minutes on transport, which is, of course, very important for connectivity.
Just 10 minutes. Oh. It deserves a whole hour, colleagues, but of course I'll be very brief. So if we talk basics, it would really help that Central Asian countries accede to the basic UN transport conventions that govern how transport moves around Europe, for example, and in many parts of the world. I'm not going to list those. Some of them date back from the 50s. They are really the basics of how a multilateral system functions. Specifically for Central Asia, though, it is critical that we optimize border crossing points. Nothing prevents the volume of goods transiting between China and Europe via this region more than bottlenecks at border crossings. So optimizing common standards, and here again I call countries to use UN standards because they are used globally, and then data exchange models, for example, the UN CFAC. Let me not spell it out for you. We have been for the past 20 years mapping this in what we call Eurasian Transport Links project. And now we've launched, together with the Islamic Development Bank, a very interesting project called the International Transport Infrastructure Observatory. I invite you to check it out online. Central Asia is there. It is a map. It's a live GIS map with layers. And you can see where the bottlenecks are. You can also see what transport routes, which of the corridor routes are most likely to be affected by climate change going forward. We need to account for climate change effects and adapt the transport sector to it. And then finally, we need to digitalize. Digitalization in the transport sector is the only way to fast track it and to make Central Asia competitive as a transit hub. So digitalize, including for multimodal. It's easier said than done because there are multiple competing systems, and countries, governments around the region are going around and shopping from bidders who are offering them nice-looking presentations. We suggest to look again at the basics, at the instruments that exist. For example, the international tier system, which had been moving trucks around Europe for the past 40 years and now has a digital form. Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan hopefully will accede to electronic tier this year. And if it happens, we will for the first time have a fully ready road corridor between these countries. Finally, I want to draw your attention to the fact that when we say corridors, we need to be mindful that different countries have different interests. And so, for example, being in Bishkek not so long ago, I know how much they are keen to be a multimodal hub in between China and Uzbekistan and the rail link that the president of Kyrgyzstan mentioned today. This is another middle corridor. And we need to be realistic about the interests of the countries and build our narratives, including as international organizations, in such a way that is making it clear all corridors are welcome, but there needs to be border crossing facilitation. So trade facilitation is extremely important, and the region is doing much better now. The trade facilitation indicators are going up, but come to a border crossing, and you'll see, still. And second, what is the economic feasibility for traders? We need to ask the private sector. We can't just be in the room with big international financial institutions drawing up maps of infrastructure projects. Businesses need to speak. Like with hydrogen transport, which is currently not economically feasible on large distances, unfortunately the transit and multimodal transit via some of the routes is not economically feasible. I was sitting next to a private sector colleague from Abu Dhabi at lunch, and I asked him, what in your view is the biggest challenge to trade connectivity in Central Asia? You know what he told me? Insurance. Get the insurance market to work in a sufficiently robust way so that all these beautiful roads and rail projects, intermodal connectors, digitalization investments are actually then put to good use by traders, by actual forwarders and the private sector more broadly.
Thank you, Dimitri. I would like to give you the floor, Farouk, so that you can tell us in Tajikistan what is the obstacles people are facing with transport and the connectivity in the region, transport, and how, of course, the private sector that you're helping could improve this connectivity by physical transport.
Thank you. I will probably start from this point, is that it's a working process always. Work in progress. We as a country started not that long time ago, and initially, of course, we wanted to be, sovereign and, to make sure that we control everything. But now, situation is changing, of course, with the help of IFIs and with the. But the problem here is, again, I agree with my colleagues here, is that soft infrastructure remains undeveloped. And if you will look at the average speed of the cargo being transferred, so it not even improved, but also become even less fast. So we are talking somewhere around 20 kilometers per hour, which is very low in average for Central Asia. I would say that what is here important is creating the base loads. It's not necessarily only required to have the transportation systems, but also we need to have producers. We need to make sure that the private sector is developing, it produces, it exports, it imports. Because when there is a demand, insurance will appear, cargo companies will appear. At the beginning, it might be neighbors who will start doing business in Tajikistan, for instance, but then Tajikistan companies will develop themselves as well. I think we also should not be afraid to be bold, and look south, towards the south as well. There is a terra incognita, Afghanistan, next to us, right? We know that they exist, but somehow we don't interact much. But it seems that now that direction also is getting a lot of attention. And Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, including Tajikistan as well, we all have some projects devoted to develop the trade with Afghanistan and further with Pakistan, which is, by the way, the closest seaport for all of us on this side. So giving the room to the private sector is very important, I think, at this stage. And I hope that there is a common understanding within the all governments of the Central Asia that improving the investment climate, setting up a level playing field for the private sector is needed, and we need to develop that.
Do you think that should be set in this region to develop private sector some kind of arbitral tribunal, that if you have a problem, you can go to it exists on other continents, it exists, for instance, in Africa for investments, to a court that would be maybe sitting not in Central Asia, or sitting in another place, or why not in Central Asia, it doesn't mind, but so that investors are not scared, so that they are kind of internal, that you can have an international between these 5 countries, arbitral court that decide if you have a a problem in this country or or another country. What do you think about that? Do you have an idea, Erkin, about that?
I can start maybe, and
Yeah.
then colleagues will add. So there are several layers of arbitrages available already within the country. Every country there are some international ones. You know, you can bring organizations like MIGA who will take some of the risks, including political risks from the business cases, from the business projects. I think what we need to make, we need to add stimulus to development of the private sector in general. My dream is that we, as all 5 countries, will start compete on bringing investors, to each other. Like we Tajiks will compete to bring more Uzbeks and Kazakhs to Tajikistan. And this is, by the way, it's happening now with Uzbekistan. We see that there is more and more Tajiks going and setting up business there as well because of the different reasons. So if there will be a will to create stimulus for the private sector, maybe the need in arbitrages will decrease as well. And giving a short response to your question, there are some mechanisms available already, including the Institute of I'm trying to remember the name of business ombudsman. Yes, yeah. So including the business ombudsmans in all 5 countries. So that exists already. Thanks.
Thank you. So I would like to switch to now to connectivity, people, cultural connectivity. Aziza, is there lingua franca in these 5 countries? There used to be one, Russian, but the population is very young, we have been told. So is there a competition between Russian and maybe English coming? We're talking now English, Turkish, Chinese, I don't know. First, let's speak about the language and then we'll speak about culture and politics. So about language. What is the current lingua franca of this region?
I think current lingua franca among young populations is TikTok, and it just has no languages, it's just TikTok. But just on a serious note, I think what we've seen in Uzbekistan with a young generation, there is definitely a lot of gravitation towards learning English. And there is even a government sponsoring, the cost of the exams is being reimbursed if you're getting more than 7 on IELTS. We also have now interesting phenomena. In the last 2 years, 3 Uzbeks outside of Tashkent from the state schools got admitted on full 100% scholarship to Yale University. From Nukuz, from Samarkand, and from Jizak region, small village. We have this year a girl from the public school who got admitted on 100% scholarship to Harvard. So I think in general now with all these role modeling in the society, people just realize, okay, it's great to have more languages learned. We have, I compare to India, we have so many learning centers, like every street would have now 3-4 learning centers, and they offer SAT prep, they offer IELTS, they offer math, they offer STEM, all different types of extracurricular activities. And that's something that, in my view, is definitely driven because we have young generation who is exposed to, because of internet and phones. We have 7 million phones, 70 million mobile users who are exposed to the outside world. But I think it's also something that we are not able yet to rationalize. So they are very, they don't have any borders. We might have, our generation, I'm 41, we are more or less the same age, they have no borders. Everything for them is open. So I definitely see that young generation is almost everywhere the same, including Central Asia. But I would like to give you what I found as a fascinating discovery. I spent half a year at Davis Center for Eurasian Studies at Harvard University. I just came back January this year. And when I was working in the Widener Library, number 2 in the size in the US, I found a fascinating book by Edward Allworth, who was a very acknowledged professor at Columbia who wrote in 1962 a book about publishing business in Central Asia in the 19th century. And I thought it just fascinating. So basically he said that in the middle of 19th century, in Turkestan, so the territory of the modern Central Asia, there were two different centers that were actually the bustling place for publishing books. One was at the territory of Kazakhstan, publishing in Kazakh language. Second was in the Khiva Khanate, it's ancient Khwarezm, where it was also the bustling place for publishing. And basically what happened, fascinated by Tabriz, by Kabul, by Lahore, elites and educated people in this part of the world also wanted to have lithography, to basically have automated printing for books. Kazakhs did it because they wanted to educate and introduce books in the schooling system, so educate children and illiterate people. In Khiva Khanate, it was just as a hobby of the Khan, and he wanted books to be distributed to educated elites. But afterwards, because all were writing in an Arab script, everything actually was interchangeable. It was easy to understand. And basically that's how in the second half of 19th century, books in the region traveled and people would be reading. So poetry from the Khan's court in Khiva and, maths books that were actually distributed for children by Kazakh elite. And it enormously gave a boost to exchange of ideas. After all, connectivity is not only about railroads. Connectivity is not only about having borders easily crossed. I think the utmost importance of connectivity is having ideas exchanged intensively in the region, vision setting, building the common understanding for the future, foresighting together. And I wish we had more opportunities for that within the region, because I'm one of those optimists who sees always the glass half full rather than just half empty. That's what I wanted to share with you. Thank you.
Well, I would answer for this question from Kazakhstan perspective. It might be not representative for other Central Asian countries, but generally. Generally speaking, the Russian language remains as a franca lingua in nearby future in all Central Asian states, in particular in Kazakhstan. It's already registered as official language in Kazakhstan. Yes, but it really depends who you're asking for this question. It really depends on the demography, because as Aziza said, the younger you are, the less you know Russian language, and there is no substitute. There is not enough English language knowledge in Central Asia states. We are still remained in the kind of in the bottom ratings of English language knowing in the world ratings. So there is no, of course, there is no any perspective for Chinese, for other languages, and there is no any kind of how would say it's a artificial language. Remember this, how it's artificial language? Esperanto. There is no kind of Esperanto for our region. This is artificially. So it's a Russian language remains as a...
General de Gaulle, in a famous speech, used to make fun of Volapük, some kind of, Brussels language. So he would make fun of Volapük, and of course you have no Esperanto, no Volapük in
But this is a very important question in terms of connectivity, because if we lose Russian language, in what language we're gonna speak with each other? Is it going to be English language, any language, or Turk language? We don't know. So we have to think about it. And we have to be very careful about Russian language as well, because I'm quite adamant for knowing as many languages as possible. We have to learn many languages. This is our wealth. This is our strong side. We know we are bilateral. We know a lot of languages. We don't know only one language. For example, in Kazakhstan, the majority of population know Russian and Kazakh language. It's good. I mean, this is what is, and we have to learn English language, Because city developers, they know English very well. But if you go outside any big city, there is no opportunity to speak any language besides Kazakh and Kazakh language. Yeah.
Dmitry, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, 3 points. First, I think the common language is Dastarhan, honestly. It's the hospitality, is the tradition, and I think it is very important to maintain it no matter what generation. However, on a more serious note, I do believe that the multicultural competencies need to be built up. If Central Asia is serious about utilizing its potential, people do need to invest in Chinese, Arabic, Turkish, Russian, of course, which is a comparative advantage the region shouldn't be losing. It is naturally there. Don't lose it. It's happening in many post-Soviet countries where people, younger generation, lose what actually then they need to catch up on. And it is not about being friends with Russia. It is about using a comparative advantage of a lingua franca. And then, second point, the real common language, though, and I really agree with Aziz's point about foresight, should be innovation. This region cannot be sustainable. Sustainable development goals for Central Asia will not be achieved at current pace of development as business as usual scenario. You need to leapfrog. You need to have a booming startup ecosystem that generates completely new generation of solutions, ideally big enough for the big Silicon Valley guys and ladies to be interested, so join up forces between countries. And you need to have a generation of innovators who want to change business models and apply new tech. So innovation should be the language. And finally, I wanted to talk about, maybe not today, about the 2 speeds. While I appreciate the really good examples that Aziza gave about rural areas catching up, I do believe there are 2 Central Asias out there. And regional development within countries, especially the large ones, is as important as connectivity between countries. And then the famous the hotspot or opportunity spot of Fergana Valley, where you have deeply rural, highly fertile, very, very interconnected land of opportunity or conflict, depending on what you do with it and how neighbors can talk to each other, is something we shouldn't forget. And this goes beyond railroad languages. It is actually about the fabric of neighborhood that needs to be built. It's for a good reason the European Union has prioritized the union of the regions as much as the union of the countries.
Thank you. William, I would like you to have your assessment, and then Aziza, and it will be also your conclusion. For 1.5 minutes. So I'm listening to you, William.
In that case, I may revert to harder subjects of trade, because I have some thoughts on the cultural thing, but I was born further from this region than anyone on the panel, I think, so I'll leave it to those who are more local. I wanted to come back a few points on connectivity. First of all, when we're talking about things like digitalization and that Dmitry was raising, I think an important point that we find in our work on trade facilitation indicators and on digitalization of public services and customs is it's not just about coordination across states, it's about coordination within states. We see very concrete examples where customs is digitalized, but the tax service is not, or is on a different system. And I'll tell you what, digital sounds great until you realize that you also have to keep doing the paperwork on paper, in which case you're doing everything twice. And so oddly enough, uptake of a lot of these digital services is impeded because the private sector actors realize it's duplicative. It has to be streamlined within as well as across countries. The second point comes from what you were saying about the rate of traffic being quite slow in the region. And despite the increase in trade facilitation indicators, and it's simply to make the point that we really have to run fast to get anywhere, because what we found in our 2019 study that we presented here at the forum was there'd been tremendous progress on the TFIs, and in many places border crossing times had gotten substantially worse. And the reason was simply that traffic was growing faster, which is great, but we weren't keeping up with the growth of traffic. So we need to realize that we have an enormous challenge there. And I think the last thing, coming back to your points about private sector development, it is absolutely critical when we think about the big corridors and drawing lines across maps that have big high-speed rail, that we not neglect the multimodal regional and national infrastructures that feed that. And that actually means I end precisely where I started, not to build a transit region, but to build an integrated region. And that means we cannot let attention to big things like the BRI neglect the fact that we still have a long way to go to create real data-driven, multimodal, integrated transport policies that are also coherent with our economic development objectives.
When you use BRI, it's not Banque des Règlements Internationaux, what is this BRI?
The Belt and Road Initiative.
Okay, good. Thank you. So, Aziza, in 1 minute, your conclusion, please.
Yes, sure. What I would like to say is just trying to echo what was said before. I think we need to innovate, but innovate also in the way the public administration works. And delivery unit that I represent, it's a part of a big agency for strategic reforms. And of course, agency deals with the new regulations, policies, connecting the dots, coordination of IFIs. But my work specifically is to make sure that we are getting our hands dirty with experimentation. So basically, we are tracking very difficult priorities in the area of healthcare, education, drinking water. And as just Dmitry mentioned, so basically we have to map digitally and see whether every village in Uzbekistan, you know, what they have actually. Do they have drinking water? How is the state of affairs with the building of new schools? Do schools have under new government program solar panels? There's also a state program on distributing supplements and iodine to 8 million children a year. So basically try to bring two Central Asias into one, at least in the context of one country, and really make sure, as today was said by President of Kazakhstan as well, we are getting beyond the headlines. So we're just really trying to see how all these important state policies are trickling down to the level of the communities and whether actually it has an impact on the populace, so on citizens. And that's something that I wanted to say. So innovation for Central Asia is essential way to have a better future.
Thank you. Farouk, 1 minute, and then, of course, our host, Yerkin, will have the last word. So, Farouk, do you want to have a 1 minute conclusion?
Yeah, I think that when we talk about the connectivity, we should not forget about digital connectivity as well, and investment into backbone infrastructure with high-speed internet is also important, including the last mile accesses. And it definitely should not be neglected. It's the future. I also think that we are witnessing probably Silk Road 2.0 development in Central Asia. We should avoid mistakes as much as possible and try to navigate between the interests of the bigger powers these days very carefully.
Thank you very much. Yerkin, thank you again for Kazakhstan to welcome us and to host us. Can I ask you a 1 minute conclusion?
First of all, thank you for your wonderful moderation, and thank you the audience for this stamina, for these sleepy hours, and for jet lag. I see that there is a very good perspective on Central Asia connectivity and cooperation, and everything in our hands. So we have to start with some steps, call it baby steps, initial steps, and move forward, because there is no any obstacle to cooperate, because there is a real ground, internal and external challenges we are facing right now. And what is good for Central Asia is good for the world. So let's start with the cooperation with the world.
Thank you very much for this good conclusion. It's 3:45, we're on time. The session is over. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.